Hey there, folks. Frank here, coming at you with another mind-blowing story from my channel. Before we dive in, I gotta ask, if you're watching this and you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. I mean, come on, 96 of you are watching without subscribing, and that just breaks this old man's heart. Also, smash that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about today's story. Your engagement really keeps me going at 67 years old. So welcome back to Mind-Blowing Stories. This channel has got hundreds of crazy tales from real life, and today I'm sharing something very personal. Grab your coffee, settle in, because this one's a doozy. My name is Frank Morrison, and I'm a 67-year-old retiree living in Toledo, Ohio. Spent 42 years as a mechanic before hanging up my wrench for good. These days I spend my time gardening, playing chess at the community center, and making these videos for all of you beautiful people. Now, the story I'm about to tell you happened back in 1978 when I was just 25 years old, living in Detroit and working at Mickey's Auto Shop on Corktown. It was a Tuesday in September, I remember, because the Tigers were playing their final home series, and everyone in Detroit was talking about it. I was under the hood of a '74 Camaro when I heard the sweetest voice ask, "Excuse me, is anyone available to look at my car?" I slid out from under that Camaro, wiping my greasy hands on my coveralls. And I swear to God, folks, when I looked up, I thought I was seeing an angel. Standing there in a white sundress with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light was the most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on. She had these green eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief, and when she smiled, I nearly dropped my wrench. "Ma'am," I stammered, suddenly very aware of how I must look with grease on my face and motor oil under my fingernails. "I'm Frank. What seems to be the trouble?" She pointed to a red 1976 Mustang parked outside. "She's making this terrible grinding noise when I brake, and there's this rattling when I turn left." Now, I'd been working on cars since I was 16, started helping my dad in his garage, but I took extra care with this one. Her name was Susan Martinez, she told me, and she was new to Detroit, working as a secretary at some big law firm downtown. While I worked on her car, she sat in the waiting area reading a book. Every now and then, I'd catch her looking at me, and we'd exchange these shy smiles. The brake pads were shot, and she needed new tie rods. Simple enough fix, but it would take a couple days to get the parts. "No problem," she said. "I can take the bus to work." "Tell you what," I heard myself saying before I could think better of it. "I get off at 6. How about I give you a ride home?" She smiled that smile again. "I'd like that, Frank." And so began the most incredible 3 months of my young life. Susan lived in a small apartment in Midtown. Nothing fancy, but she'd made it cozy with plants and books everywhere. That first night, I drove her home, and we sat in my truck talking until nearly midnight. She told me she'd grown up in Phoenix, that she'd come to Detroit for a fresh start after a bad relationship. I told her about my dreams of maybe opening my own shop someday, about how I loved working with my hands, fixing things that were broken. "I like that," she said. "There's something beautiful about making broken things whole again." The next evening, I picked her up from work. She was wearing this blue dress that made her eyes look like emeralds, and she'd done something different with her hair. "I thought maybe you'd like to grab dinner," I said. "There's this little Italian place, Mama Lucia's, makes the best lasagna in Detroit." Over dinner, I learned more about her. She loved old movies. Casablanca was her favorite. She read mystery novels voraciously. She had this laugh that was like music, and when she concentrated on something, she'd bite her lower lip in this adorable way. "What about you, Frank?" she asked, twirling her spaghetti. "What makes you happy?" "Right now?" I looked across the table at her. "This, right here. This makes me happy." She blushed, and I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. We started seeing each other every night. I'd pick her up from work, and we'd go for drives along the Detroit River, watching the freighters go by. Sometimes we'd go to the movies. We saw Grease 3 times because she loved it so much. Other nights we'd just sit in her apartment, listening to Fleetwood Mac records and talking about everything and nothing. After about a month, things got serious between us. I mean really serious. She'd spend weekends at my little house in Hamtramck, and I was already thinking about asking her to move in permanently. Hell, I was thinking about marriage, folks. This woman had completely turned my world upside down. But here's where things start getting strange, and you're going to want to stick around for this because it gets wild. Susan was mysterious about certain things. She never talked about her past relationships in detail, always changed the subject when I asked about her family. She didn't have any photos in her apartment, which I thought was odd, and sometimes she'd get these phone calls that she'd take in the other room, speaking in hushed tones. One evening in November, I showed up at her apartment unannounced with Chinese takeout, wanting to surprise her. The door was unlocked, which was unusual, so I walked in calling her name. That's when I heard her on the phone in the bedroom, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "Richard, please, just give me more time," she was saying. "I told you I need space to think." "No, I can't just come back, because I'm not ready. I know what I promised, but things have changed." I stood there frozen, holding that bag of Chinese food, feeling like someone had punched me in the gut. Richard? Who the hell was Richard? When she came out and saw me, her face went white as a sheet. "Frank, I didn't hear you come in." "Who's Richard, Susan?" The look in her eyes. I'll never forget it. It was fear, pure and simple. "It's complicated," she said, sitting down on her couch and putting her head in her hands. "Uncomplicate it for me." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Richard is my husband." Folks, I'm telling you, that moment right there changed everything. The woman I was falling in love with, the woman I was planning a future with, was married. "Your husband?" I set the food down, feeling like I might be sick. "Susan, what the hell?" "Separated," she said quickly. "We're separated, Frank. Have been for 6 months. But he won't sign the divorce papers. He keeps saying he wants to work things out, but I can't go back to him. I won't." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was scared you'd run away. And because Richard isn't a good man, Frank. He's powerful, he's connected, and he doesn't like to lose." That's when she told me the whole story. Richard Sterling. And yes, those Sterlings. The ones who owned half the real estate in downtown Detroit. Susan had married him when she was just 19, fresh out of high school, swept away by his money and charm. But Richard had a dark side. He was controlling, possessive, and according to Susan, he had connections to some very unsavory people. "He's been having me followed, Frank. That's how he knew I was in Detroit. He knows about you." "What does that mean?" "It means we have to be careful, very careful." But you know what? I was 25 years old, I was in love, and I was stubborn as hell. I didn't care about Richard Sterling or his money or his connections. I cared about Susan, and if she wanted out of that marriage, I was going to help her get out. "We'll figure this out," I told her, "together." And for a while, we did figure it out. Susan filed for divorce, got herself a good lawyer. Richard's people would show up sometimes, guys in expensive suits sitting in cars outside my work or her apartment. But we ignored them. We kept seeing each other, kept planning for our future. Then December came, and everything went to hell. I was working late at the shop one evening when 2 men walked in. They weren't customers. You could tell by looking at them. Expensive suits, cold eyes, the kind of men who solve problems with their fists. "You Frank Morrison?" the taller one asked. "Depends who's asking. Mr. Sterling would like a word." Now, I could have said no, should have said no, but I wanted to look this Richard Sterling in the eye, wanted him to know that Susan had chosen me. They drove me to this fancy restaurant downtown, the kind of place where a single meal cost more than I made in a week. Richard Sterling was waiting in a private dining room. A big man, maybe 45, with silver hairs and cold blue eyes. He was everything I wasn't. Rich, powerful, refined. "Frank," he said, standing up and extending his hand like we were old friends. "I've heard so much about you." I didn't shake his hand. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Please sit down. Let's talk like civilized men." "I've got nothing to say to you." "Oh, but I have plenty to say to you." He gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Frank, please." I sat, mainly because those two guys from the shop were standing by the door. "Susan is my wife," Richard said, cutting into a steak. "Has been for 6 years. Now I understand she's been confused lately. Going through a phase, you might say. But phases pass, and wives come home. She doesn't want to come home. She wants a divorce. What Susan wants and what Susan gets are two different things." He took a bite of his steak, chewed thoughtfully. "You see, Frank, I've invested a lot in that marriage. Time, money, emotion. I'm not inclined to walk away from my investments. She's not an investment. She's a person. She's my person, and you're going to stop seeing her. Like hell I am." That's when his expression changed, became something darker. "Frank, let me explain something to you. I own half of downtown Detroit. I have judges on speed dial, cops on payroll, and friends who can make problems disappear. You, on the other hand, are a grease monkey from Hamtramck who makes what, 30 grand a year? Do you really think you can compete with me? Susan doesn't love you." "Love?" He laughed. "Son, love doesn't pay for penthouses and jewelry and European vacations. Love doesn't provide security and status. What can you give her, Frank? A life of struggle? A house in the suburbs if she's lucky?" I stood up. "I can give her happiness. Happiness is a luxury for people who can afford it. Susan had happiness with me until she got these foolish ideas about independence. But don't worry, she'll come around. And if she doesn't," Richard Sterling set down his fork and looked at me with those cold eyes, "then you'll have to convince her. Because if you don't, I'll have to find other ways to solve this problem. And trust me, Frank, you don't want me to solve problems my way." The threat was clear. I left that restaurant knowing that Richard Sterling wasn't just going to let Susan go. He was going to fight for her, and he was going to play dirty. I told Susan about the meeting the next day. She went pale when I described Richard's threats. "We have to leave Detroit," she said. "Both of us. Tonight." "Susan, we can't just run." "Yes, we can." She grabbed my hands. "Frank, you don't know what he's capable of. I've seen what he does to people who cross him. We can go to California, start over. I have some money saved, and you can find work anywhere." The plan was simple. Susan would pack her things, I'd get my savings from the bank, and we'd meet at the Greyhound station at midnight. From there, we'd take a bus to Los Angeles and disappear. I spent that day in a daze, going through the motions at work while my mind raced. Was I really going to leave everything I'd ever known for this woman? My job, my friends, my life in Detroit? Yes. Yes, I was. Because I loved her more than I'd ever loved anything. That night, I packed a single duffel bag with my clothes and took the $800 I had saved from my bedroom dresser. I got to the bus station at 11:45, bought 2 tickets to Los Angeles, and waited. Midnight came and went. No Susan. 12:30. Still no Susan. At 1 a.m., I called her apartment. No answer. I waited until 3 a.m. before finally accepting that she wasn't coming. The next morning, I drove to her apartment. The door was locked, and when I got the landlord to let me in, the place was empty. Not just her stuff was gone. Everything was gone. It was like Susan Martinez had never existed. I went to her law firm. They told me no one by that name had ever worked there. For weeks, I searched for her. I called every hotel in Detroit, checked with the police, even hired a private investigator with money I couldn't afford to spend. Nothing. Susan had vanished without a trace. Then 3 weeks later, I got my answer in the worst possible way. I was reading the Detroit Free Press over coffee when I saw the headline, "Local Woman Dies in Car Crash." Below it was a photo that made my blood freeze. It was Susan, but the name in the article was Susan Sterling, not Martinez. According to the paper, Susan Sterling, wife of prominent businessman Richard Sterling, had died when her car went off the Ambassador Bridge in the early hours of December 23rd. Her body was never recovered from the Detroit River, but pieces of her car and personal effects had been found. She was presumed dead. The article mentioned that she had been struggling with depression and that the crash might have been suicide. I dropped that newspaper and threw up right there in my kitchen. Susan was dead. The woman I loved, the woman I was going to run away with, was dead. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard Sterling had something to do with it. I went to the funeral, stood in the back of the cathedral while Richard Sterling played the grieving husband. He gave this beautiful eulogy about loving his wife and how she'd been struggling with mental illness. When his eyes met mine across that crowded church, he gave me the slightest nod, like he was acknowledging a job well done. I left Detroit a month later. Couldn't stand being in that city anymore, surrounded by memories of Susan. I moved here to Toledo, got a job at Miller's Auto Repair, and tried to build a new life. But I never forgot Susan Martinez. How could I? Now, folks, you're probably thinking that's the end of the story. Tragic love affair, mysterious death, heartbroken man moves away to start over. But remember, this is mind-blowing stories, and we don't do simple endings here. Because 30 years later, in 2008, I was sitting in a Starbucks in Cleveland. I'd driven over to visit my cousin Martha, when I looked up from my newspaper and nearly had a heart attack. There, standing in line to order a latte, was Susan Martinez. Older, yes. Her hair was silver now instead of auburn, and she had lines around her eyes, but it was her. Same green eyes, same way of biting her lower lip when she concentrated. Same graceful way of moving. My hands were shaking as I watched her order her drink. She was using the name Linda Watson, paying with a credit card that had that name on it. But it was Susan. I'd stake my life on it. I followed her out to the parking lot, my heart hammering in my chest. "Susan?" She turned around, and when she saw me, she dropped her coffee. Just let it fall right out of her hands. "Frank?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh my God, Frank. You're supposed to be dead." She looked around nervously, like she was afraid someone might be watching. "We can't talk here. Meet me at the Holiday Inn on Euclid Avenue in an hour. Room 237. An hour later, I was knocking on the door of room 237. When Susan opened it, she looked like she'd been crying. "I can't believe it's really you," she said. And before I could say anything, she was in my arms holding me tight. "Susan, what the hell happened? I went to your funeral." That's when she told me the truth, and folks, this is where the story gets really mind-blowing. Susan had never intended to run away with me that night in 1978. She couldn't, because Richard Sterling had made it clear that if she ever left him, he would kill not just me, but her sister Maria in Phoenix and her elderly parents in Tucson. He'd shown her photos of all of them, let her know they were being watched. "So I made a different plan," she said, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. "Richard had taken out a massive life insurance policy on me the year before. $2 million. He thought he was being smart, protecting his investment. But I realized that policy could be my way out." "You faked your own death." "With help." There was a nurse at Detroit General, Carmen Rodriguez, whose brother worked for Richard sometimes. Carmen hated what she'd seen Richard do to people, and when I approached her, she agreed to help me disappear. The plan had been elaborate. Carmen had provided Susan with a death certificate and medical records indicating severe depression and suicidal ideation. Susan had driven her car to the Ambassador Bridge that night, but instead of going into the river with it, she jumped out at the last second. Carmen was waiting with a different car and a new identity. Linda Watson, complete with social security number and driver's license. I let Richard collect the insurance money, Susan continued. Figured it was the least he owed me for 6 years of hell. Then I moved to Sacramento, started over. Why didn't you contact me? Susan, I thought I'd lost you forever. She was crying now, real tears. Because I was a coward, Frank. I was so scared of Richard finding me that I couldn't risk it. And as the years went by, I convinced myself you'd moved on, found someone else, forgotten about me. I never married Susan, never even came close. Neither did I. God, Frank, not a day went by that I didn't think about you, didn't wonder what might have been. We spent the rest of that afternoon talking, catching up on 30 years of life. Susan, Linda, had worked as a bookkeeper in Sacramento, lived quietly, never drawing attention to herself. She'd kept track of Richard Sterling through the internet. He'd remarried twice, divorced twice, and finally died of a heart attack in 2005. I was free, she said. Finally free. But I didn't know how to find you. Didn't even know if you'd want to see me. Want to see you? Susan, I've loved you for 30 years. That evening, we drove back to Toledo together. She came to see my little house, met my neighbor Bob, who's been trying to set me up with his sister-in-law for 10 years. We sat on my back porch drinking beer and watching the sunset, and it was like no time had passed at all. What now? She asked. Now we get the second chance we should have had 30 years ago. And that's exactly what we did, folks. Susan, she goes by Linda Watson legally now, but she'll always be Susan to me, moved to Toledo 6 months later. We got married in a simple ceremony at City Hall with my cousin Martha and neighbor Bob as witnesses. That was 17 years ago. Today, Susan is in the kitchen making her famous pot roast while I record this video. She doesn't know I'm telling this story. She's still a little paranoid about putting our past out there, even though Richard Sterling is long dead. But I figure enough time has passed, and besides, I changed enough details to protect the innocent, as they say. We're not young anymore, but we're happy, really happy. Sometimes Susan wakes up from nightmares about those days in Detroit, and sometimes I catch her looking over her shoulder when we're out in public. But we've got each other, and that's all that matters. People always ask me if I'm angry about the 30 years we lost, about the lies and the fake death and all of it. But you know what? I'm not, because those 30 years taught me something important. Real love doesn't have an expiration date. Real love waits. Real love endures. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, real love gets a second chance. So there you have it, folks. Another mind-blowing story from yours truly. What do you think? Was Susan right to fake her death? Should she have found another way? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And hey, if you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Come on, help an old man out. I've got dozens more stories where this came from. And trust me, they're all true. Well, mostly true. The important parts are true. Also, smash that like button and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. I post new stories every Tuesday and Friday, and next week I'm going to tell you about the time I accidentally got involved in a bank robbery. That's a wild one, folks. Until next time, this is Frank Morrison reminding you that truth really is stranger than fiction. Take care of yourselves, and remember, life's too short not to fight for love. Susan just called me for dinner, so I'm going to sign off now. Love you all, and I'll see you in the next video.